Did you know that every week you probably consume a credit card worth of plastics? On this episode, we get to discuss just how that is possible for every single one of us. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So in a recent episode, we discussed the impact of policies when it comes to being able to potentially create green jobs, especially in Africa and globally. But how much of that is actually happening? And today, as I mentioned in that particular episode, we get to delve deeper into one of those policies, which is the plastic bags ban in Kenya and in the region. In around 2007-2008, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda introduced a plastic bags ban in their countries. Uganda didn't really enforce it, and that meant that a lot of the plastic bags continued to be produced, manufactured, and used in the country. And while other countries in the region, including Kenya later on in 2017, introduced the ban on plastic bags, it meant that there was still an overflow across the borders into the region. So that's an example of how, in spite of having great policies in place, it can be very difficult to see the fruit and the impact of those policies if they are not effectively implemented or enforced within the countries in which the policies have been created. On this episode, we get to delve deeper into just how possible it is to be able to see the impact of something specific like plastic bags and how a potential policy or an actual policy can be able to address not just the issue of climate change, specifically in terms of environmental conservation, but also in terms of health. According to a recent study by Newcastle University, it's potentially possible that each and every one of us has been consuming a credit card worth of plastics every single week, not every month, not every year, but every single week. Take a moment to just reflect on that particular point, especially when you think about the impact of plastics when it comes to the health. And that's why it's evident to see that there's a correlation between environmental pollution and your health as an individual, ranging from lung issues to cancers that we may or may not have discovered, some diseases that have not even been named yet as a result of some of these emerging issues. So how exactly does plastic get into our bodies? One of the ways that was discovered in that particular study by Newcastle University is that most of these plastics are found in the waterways and in the oceans. And of course, that means that the fish that we consume also transmit that particular plastic into the people that consume the fish, which means you and I. And it also goes to our tap waters. For those of us who consume tap water, especially in Africa where we don't have the effective ways of being able to distill and purify our waters, you can only imagine how much of it we are consuming, because this study was probably done, yes, globally, but you can only imagine the impacts, the greater adverse impacts that could be there in the African setting. That water in which plastic bags are also found translates also to our soils, which goes all the way to our crops, meaning everything that we consume is a direct result of the plastic that flows not just into the oceans, but into the waterways. In Nairobi, for example, we have this initiative called the Nairobi River Cleaning Initiative, and a commission was set up to address that issue. But when you look at the river, you can actually see the contamination, not just of plastic, but of other forms of solid waste that continues to have direct impact on our health. You and I, at the end of the day, are the ones that are suffering the effects of this particular mismanagement and lack of proper waste management processes within our countries. Again, it goes back all the way to policy implementation, because, for example, in Kenya in 2017, the law that was effected to ban plastic bags in Kenya introduced very heavy fines for anyone who would be found littering plastic bags or carrying or using or manufacturing or retailing plastic bags. And while a report by our National Environmental Management Authority 2 years later introduced, or rather gave us the understanding that there was a significant reduction of usage of plastic bags. In fact, it mentioned that 80%, there was an 80% reduction in terms of usage of plastic bags 2 years after the ban. But when we look around, the truth is there's a lot of laxity and complacency in terms of implementation of that particular policy. And this is not just the case in Kenya. Like I mentioned, in Uganda, it's as good as not existing because it's hardly enforced within that country. In fact, it's so bad that the countries within the region complain that most of the plastic bags that are found within their countries actually flow from Uganda because of the way in which there's lack of enforcement in those countries. Of all the countries within the region, Rwanda is perceived and understood to be the most effective when it comes to the ban of plastic bags. What exactly is my point today? Like I mentioned in a previous episode, it's one thing to have policies. It's another completely different thing to have that policy working. Imagine the potential of what could be created in form of jobs when it comes to plastic bags if they were banned and actually enforced as a rule within the country. It would translate to not just better health for many of us, as there would be a reduction of the flow of those plastics into the waterways, into the oceans, and of course into the environment. But it could also result to new and beautiful and innovative ideas or alternatives to these plastic bags. It's true that very many restaurants, for example, and other retailers, for example, have continued to innovate in terms of what they use to pack, whether it's your takeaway food or different other kinds of things that ideally or initially would be used to carry the plastics. But the truth is that happens, in my view, from the middle income all the way upwards. But when it comes to the lower income, they still use, there's still a significant use of plastic bags to pack food, especially the food that is sold within the informal settlements and within the informal sector when it comes to the food that they buy, especially during their work time in terms of during the day. And the same applies to packing of not just plastic bags, or rather food in terms of takeaway, but it also applies to some of the products that are found in the supermarkets. And yes, there was an exemption after there was a bit of an outcry, especially in Kenya, from the producers and manufacturers of different products that cannot be packaged without using plastic bags. And to date, this is a couple of years later, there's still not been any significant movement towards creation of alternatives to especially change the packaging, especially around things like crisps and things like that are already bought or shipped or packaged within the plastic bags, meaning that there's still opportunity for innovation. So if you're a young person out there and you're thinking this is a problem you could solve, that's a challenge that I'm posing to you. Find an alternative that manufacturers and producers can be able to use. So later on, at least in Kenya, in 2020, there was an introduction of something that was called the ban of single-use plastics within protected areas. And that's your forests and places like that are already protected. But the truth is, even as you've heard from Ocean Soul in a previous episode, the pollution and the existence, whether it's of plastic bags or plastic bottles or flip-flops, continues to be an issue that still needs to be resolved, meaning that there's still a significant difference between policy implementation and policy formulation. And as is the nature of any policy process, there's been subsequent policies that have come up to fill in the gaps of the initial ones that were identified, especially in the 2017, in the Kenya scenario, in the 2017 plastic bags ban regulation. And that was the introduction of something called the EPR in 2021, which is the extended producer responsibility, which is a regulation that requires that anyone who produces any product that has anything to do with plastic must be part of a scheme or a group that then reports in terms of how they're able to manage that process to make sure that they're held responsible when it comes to the waste management process. And one of the challenges, of course, that many African countries face is the whole waste management processes, especially solid waste management. And so you can see the importance of policy formulation and policy implementation because, like I said earlier, just having a document or just having something written out, regardless of how well it's written out, it still will not have the desired impact or effect if it's not enforced or implemented. And therefore, from my perspective, policies become an amazing tool that can be used in terms of job creation, whether it's policies that have to do with green jobs or development of green skills in many sectors, as we mentioned earlier. We must be able to improve and go beyond policy formulation to get the point of policy implementation. What are some of the policies that you're seeing and the gaps that you're seeing? Has your country implemented the plastic bags ban? And how has it been implemented? How has it been enforced? Is there an existing policy in the first place? We'd love to hear from you what you think about the plastic bags ban in your country or in the region, and how we as individuals and as communities can be able to enforce that, because policy enforcement requires every single one of us. Government has done its part by documenting the policy, but all of us have a role to play by holding each other accountable to make sure that we play our roles in making sure that we achieve the overall objective of the policy. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And there you have it, the focus on plastic bags ban in the region. That's in the African region, but specifically in the East African region, and what has been achieved so far. Please like, share, comment in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you and be able to learn from you as well, and how you're playing your role when it comes to addressing the issue of plastic bags ban in your country or waste management in general. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacobs Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.